What if everything you learned in history class was carefully edited? Not just simplified, not just compressed to fit into a 45-minute period, but actually deliberately strategically cleaned up before it ever reached your textbook. The uncomfortable battles left out, the embarrassing programs quietly omitted, the names of people in power scrubbed from the public record because someone, somewhere, decided you didn't need to know. You probably think history class gave you the full picture. The founding fathers, the wars, the amendments, the speeches. Maybe a few footnotes about things that went wrong, mistakes that were made, lessons that were learned. Progress, right? A nation constantly improving, constantly correcting itself, moving forward. But here's what they didn't tell you. There are 99 more stories. Stories that were classified, buried, shredded, sealed in government vaults, or simply never mentioned because the people who ran history decided those particular chapters were better left unread. Not because they weren't important, because they were too important. Because if enough people knew, questions would get asked. And certain questions are deeply inconvenient for people in power. We're talking about government programs with cheerful names that concealed horrifying realities. We're talking about experiments on citizens who had no idea they were test subjects. Plots that were approved, signed, stamped, and sent up the chain of command before someone occasionally stopped them. Wars started on pretexts that were fabricated. Movements destroyed by agencies whose entire budget came from taxpayers, whose rights those same agencies were busy violating. And this isn't fringe material. This isn't someone in a basement connecting red string between photographs. Everything you're about to hear tonight is documented, declassified, confirmed by congressional testimony, Inspector General reports, FOIA requests, or the sworn statements of the people who were there. The receipts exist. Some of them took decades to surface. Some of them were only found because someone forgot to shred a filing cabinet. Some of them were buried until a single whistleblower decided their conscience mattered more than their clearance level. That's what makes this different from conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories stay in the shadows. These came out of the shadows. They're sitting in the National Archives. They've been reported in major newspapers, confirmed by federal courts, acknowledged by sitting presidents who had no choice but to say, yes, this happened, we're sorry, here's a settlement check. So tonight, we're going through 99 of them. 99 things that were taught wrong, taught incompletely, or simply never taught at all in the American history classroom. Some of them are going to make you angry. Some of them are going to make you deeply, profoundly sad. A few of them are going to make you laugh in that hollow, disbelieving way you laugh, when something is so absurd that laughter is the only reasonable response to it. Some of these happened in the 1700s. Some of them happened last decade. Some of them involve presidents, generals, directors of intelligence agencies, and decorated war heroes doing things that would get an ordinary citizen a life sentence. Some of them involve ordinary people who were simply in the wrong place when their government decided they were expendable for the greater good, or for budget reasons, or because someone in a conference room needed data and didn't want to deal with the paperwork of asking for consent. We're going to move through these steadily tonight, one after another, because that's the thing about this list. It doesn't stop. Every time you think you've hit the floor of how far things went, there's another basement, another program, another file that sat classified for 50 years before someone finally let the public see it. Now, before we begin, do me a favor, hit subscribe and leave a like on this video. I know that sounds like standard channel housekeeping, and it is, but it's also genuinely important here. Content like this doesn't get pushed by algorithms that prefer feel-good viral moments. Dark history, real history, the uncomfortable documented kind, it needs your help to actually reach people. So if you think these stories deserve to be heard, that like button is how you vote for that. Now, get comfortable, turn down the lights. If you're listening to this while you fall asleep, even better. Let these sit in the back of your mind, because that's where they've been sitting for decades anyway, locked away from public consciousness while the sanitized version of American history played on loop in every classroom in the country. 99 things they got wrong. 99 things they left out. 99 moments where the official story and the actual documented reality are two very different things. Some of these you may have heard whispers of. Some of these are going to hit you completely out of nowhere. All of them are real. History isn't always the story of progress and good intentions. Sometimes it's the story of what powerful people do when they're confident no one is watching. Tonight, we're watching. Let's start at the very beginning of American mythology and work our way forward, because it turns out the lie started even earlier than you might think. 1. Christopher Columbus discovered America. This is probably the first lie most American children ever hear, delivered with full confidence on a classroom poster featuring a man in a funny hat standing triumphantly on a beach. Columbus discovered America. Except when he arrived in 1492, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people were already living here. The Americas had been home to advanced civilizations for thousands of years. The Aztec capital Tenochtitlan was larger than any city in Europe at the time. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had a democratic governing structure that some historians argue actually influenced the framers of the Constitution. There were cities, trade routes, agriculture, philosophy, medicine, and art. Columbus didn't discover a new world. He stumbled into someone else's old one. And when he arrived, he immediately began enslaving the people he met, noting in his own journal that they would make good servants. The journal exists. We can read it. We just decided the poster version was cleaner. 2. Pilgrims sought pure religious freedom. The story goes like this. The Pilgrims were persecuted for their beliefs in England, sailed to the New World, and simply wanted to worship freely in peace. It's a beautiful story about tolerance and the human desire for liberty. It's also about half true. The Pilgrims did want freedom from persecution. That part is real. What the textbooks leave out is that they had very little interest in extending that same freedom to anyone else. The Plymouth colony had strict religious conformity requirements. People who deviated from accepted doctrine faced punishment. When Roger Williams started arguing for separation of church and state and the rights of native peoples, he was banished from Massachusetts in the middle of winter. The Puritans who followed the Pilgrims were arguably even more rigid, establishing a theocracy that punished religious dissent harshly. They didn't sail across the ocean for universal religious freedom. They sailed across it so they could run the religion themselves. 3. Thanksgiving was a harmonious first feast. Every November, millions of American school children make paper bag vests and construction paper feathers and reenact a friendly feast between Pilgrims and Native Americans, a symbol of cooperation and gratitude and shared harvest tables. The actual historical record is more complicated than a classroom craft project can contain. Yes, there was likely a meal shared in 1621 between Plymouth colonists and members of the Wampanoag Nation. What the story leaves out is everything that came after. Within decades, the relationship between English colonists and New England native peoples had collapsed into devastating warfare. King Philip's War, fought from 1675 to 1678, was one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. Thousands died. Entire native communities were destroyed or displaced. The Wampanoag leader Metacom, whom the colonists called King Philip, was killed and beheaded, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. That part never makes it onto the construction paper. 4. Pocahontas saved John Smith, exactly as told. You know the story. John Smith is captured, about to be executed, and Pocahontas throws herself over him to save his life in a dramatic act of cross-cultural love and courage. There's a Disney movie. There are paintings. There are commemorative plates. Here's the problem. John Smith didn't mention this rescue in any of his writings until 1616, more than a decade after it supposedly happened. He had written extensively about his time in Virginia before that, without including what would have been a fairly remarkable detail. Historians have debated for generations whether the event happened at all, or whether it was a ritual ceremony Smith misunderstood, or whether he invented or embellished it entirely after Pocahontas became famous in London. What is documented is considerably darker. Pocahontas was later kidnapped by English colonists, held for ransom, converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, and brought to England as a kind of living exhibit. She died there at age 21. That version doesn't translate as well to an animated musical. 5. The colonists united early as Americans. The mythology of the American Revolution loves a clean origin story. Brave colonists, united in their identity as Americans, rising up as one against British tyranny to forge a new nation. It's stirring. It's also a significant rewrite of a much messier reality. Most colonists in the years leading up to the Revolution identified primarily with their individual colony, their town, or Britain itself, not with some unified American identity that hadn't been invented yet. A substantial portion of the colonial population were loyalists who actively supported the British crown. Estimates suggest that roughly a third of colonists were loyalists, a third were patriots, and a third were trying to stay out of it entirely. Tens of thousands of loyalists were harassed, had their property seized, and were eventually driven out of the country after independence. The revolution wasn't a unanimous people rising as one. It was a civil war with a winning side that got to write the textbooks. 6. The Salem witch trials were pure mass hysteria. Salem gets taught as a cautionary tale about fear and superstition running wild through a community. Ordinary people swept up in collective panic, religion gone too far, a community undone by irrational hysteria. That framing conveniently skips over the part where Salem had been engaged in very rational, very specific conflicts long before the accusation started. The town was divided between two factions with competing interests over land, church leadership, and local political power. When you map the accusers and the accused onto a geographic and economic chart of Salem Village, a striking pattern emerges. The accusations followed property lines and old grudges with remarkable consistency. Families in disputes suddenly found their enemies named as witches. Some of the accused owned land that their accusers wanted. The hysteria was real, but it had architecture. It had motive. It had beneficiaries. Mass hysteria was the cover. Opportunism was part of the engine. 7. The Boston Tea Party protested high taxes. Taxation without representation. Every American schoolchild knows it. The colonists were being crushed by British taxes, so they dressed up as Mohawks, dumped tea in Boston Harbor, and struck a blow for economic freedom. Except here's the part that complicates the bumper sticker version. The Tea Act of 1773 that triggered the protest actually made tea cheaper. The British East India Company was drowning in surplus tea and facing bankruptcy, so Parliament let them sell directly to the colonies, cutting out the colonial merchants who had been acting as middlemen. The price went down. The colonists were not reacting to a tax increase. They were reacting to Parliament's assertion that it had the right to tax them at all, even when the practical effect was lower prices. The men who dumped that tea were also, not coincidentally, colonial merchants whose profitable smuggling operations were being undercut by cheaper legal tea. The principle was real. The economic self-interest behind it was also real. Both things can be true, and the textbooks only ever mention one of them. 8. The American Revolution was fought by everyone. The textbook image is practically iconic. Farmers and shopkeepers and blacksmiths, united as one people, rising up against British tyranny in a glorious common cause. The reality of who actually fought and who didn't is considerably more complicated. A significant chunk of the colonial population wanted nothing to do with independence. Loyalists, the colonists who supported the crown, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They weren't just wealthy elites clinging to privilege. They were farmers, ministers, small business owners, and tradespeople who genuinely believed breaking from Britain was a catastrophic mistake. Then there were the enslaved people, roughly 500,000 of them, who had their own calculations to make. Many chose to fight for the British, who promised freedom in exchange for service. Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775 offered liberty to enslaved men who escaped patriot owners and joined British forces. Thousands did. The revolution looked very different depending on where you stood, and the people who stood on the wrong side got written almost entirely out of the story we decided to tell. 9. Paul Revere rode alone, warning the colonies. Longfellow's poem sealed it into American mythology. One man, riding through the night, warning a sleeping nation that the British were coming. Paul Revere, lone hero of the midnight ride, galloping into history. What actually happened was more of a coordinated group effort, which is somehow less poetic but considerably more impressive as a piece of logistics. On the night of April 18, 1775, multiple riders were dispatched to warn the countryside. William Dawes rode out on a different route at roughly the same time as Revere. Samuel Prescott joined them partway through. When British soldiers stopped Revere and Dawes and arrested Revere briefly, it was actually Prescott who completed the ride to Concord and delivered the warning. Revere never finished the route. He was captured, lost his horse, and walked back to Lexington. Dawes fell from his horse and didn't complete the mission either. The alarm spread because of a network of riders, not one man's heroic gallop through the dark. Longfellow needed a rhyme and picked the name that fit. 10. George Washington had wooden teeth. This one is so specific and so confidently wrong that it almost deserves a kind of respect. It has been repeated in classrooms, cartoons, and casual conversations for generations. Washington had wooden teeth. It's practically the man's second most famous characteristic after the cherry tree, which we'll get to shortly. Washington did have terrible dental problems his entire adult life. By the time he was inaugurated, he had only one natural tooth remaining. He wore dentures for most of his presidency, and they were genuinely uncomfortable, which explains why his mouth looks so strained in almost every portrait. But wooden? Not even close. His dentures were constructed from ivory carved from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, human teeth, likely purchased from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, cow and horse teeth, and metal alloys including lead. They were painful, ill-fitting, and distorted the shape of his mouth. The true story of Washington's teeth is actually more disturbing than the wooden version. Dentists specifically have nightmares about it, but we went with wood because it sounds funnier and raises fewer uncomfortable questions. 11. Washington never lied and chopped down a cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie. Washington confessed to his father that he had chopped down the cherry tree, demonstrating his perfect, almost superhuman honesty. It is the foundational American morality tale, the origin story of national integrity. It is also completely made up. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, a bookseller and part-time minister who wrote a biography of Washington shortly after his death in 1799. Weems needed the book to sell, and hagiography moves copies faster than honest biography. The cherry tree story appeared for the first time in the 5th edition of his book, years after Washington's death, with no historical source, no contemporaneous account, and no evidence it ever happened. Weems essentially wrote early American fan fiction and marketed it as biography. Washington was, by most accounts, an admirable figure in various ways, but he was also a man who owned 317 enslaved people at the time of his death, speculated in Western land, and had a complicated relationship with honesty like most politicians. The cherry tree version was easier to put on a classroom wall. 12. The Declaration created equality in practice. All men are created equal. It is one of the most famous sentences in human history, and when American students learn the Declaration of Independence, it tends to be presented as a genuine statement of universal human equality that the nation then went about fulfilling. Jefferson wrote those words while owning over 600 human beings across the course of his lifetime. He did not free them when he signed the Declaration. He did not free most of them when he died. The equality declared in 1776 applied in practice to a fairly specific group, landowning white men. Women couldn't vote. Enslaved people were property. Native peoples were explicitly excluded. Poor white men without property faced voting restrictions in many states. The Declaration was a genuinely radical document in some ways, and its ideals have been invoked by people fighting for equality ever since, which is part of its real power. But the gap between what it declared and what it created was not an oversight or a work in progress. It was the architecture. The house was designed that way. 13. The founders were united on democracy. The founding fathers are often taught as a harmonious brotherhood of democratic visionaries who agreed on the basic principle that the people should rule. The actual Constitutional Convention of 1787 was filled with men who were openly, explicitly terrified of the people ruling. Alexander Hamilton called direct democracy turbulent and contending. John Adams worried about the tyranny of the majority. Elbridge Gerry said that the evils of the country flowed from an excess of democracy. These weren't fringe opinions, they were mainstream among the men drafting the document. The Senate was originally designed to be elected by state legislatures, not by voters directly. That didn't change until 1913. The Electoral College was created specifically to put a buffer between popular opinion and the presidency. The Supreme Court is appointed, not elected, and serves for life. These were not compromises grudgingly made. They were features deliberately built in by men who thought most people shouldn't have too much say in government. The founders didn't all believe in democracy. Several of them believed in protecting the right people from it. 14. The Constitution was designed for everyone equally. The Constitution is taught as the foundational document of American equality, a framework for justice that has protected the rights of all Americans. What it actually protected in 1787 was considerably more selective. The Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as three-fifths of a person for the purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power while those same people had no rights at all. The Constitution explicitly protected the slave trade until 1808. Voting was left to the states, and most states restricted it to white men who owned property. Women had no constitutional protections for political participation. Native peoples were excluded entirely. The document that gets framed as a gift to all humanity was negotiated between property-owning men to protect the interests of property-owning men, including the interest of owning people as property. Its later amendments expanded rights significantly, which is real progress worth acknowledging. But those expansions happened because people fought for generations against what the original document permitted. The Constitution became more equal. It did not begin that way. 15. The Electoral College ensures pure democracy. The way it's usually explained, the Electoral College is presented as some kind of enlightened system that perfectly balances big states and small states, while faithfully reflecting the will of the people. What it actually does is make it entirely possible for the loser of the popular vote to become president, which has now happened multiple times. In 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, the candidate with fewer votes nationwide won the White House. The system overweights voters in swing states and makes millions of ballots effectively irrelevant in safe states. Rural voters in a handful of states end up with far more influence than urban majorities. The Electoral College wasn't designed as a shrine to democracy. It was a compromise between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, and a mechanism the framers hoped would filter, and if necessary, overrule direct popular choice. It has worked exactly as designed, which is the problem. 16. Checks and balances always prevent abuse. Textbooks like to present checks and balances as a kind of automatic force field against tyranny. The branches of government restrain each other, abuses are stopped, and the system self-corrects by design. In practice, checks and balances only work when people in power actually want to use them. During the Red Scare, Congress mostly went along with loyalty oaths, blacklists, and witch hunts. During Japanese-American internment in World War II, the Supreme Court upheld the mass incarceration of citizens based on ancestry in Korematsu. For decades, Congress let presidents wage undeclared wars while rubber-stamping vague authorizations after the fact. Courts have deferred to claims of national security again and again, from COINTELPRO to the War on Terror. When political will collapses, institutions don't rise heroically to the moment. They frequently ratify the abuse, look the other way, or show up decades later to say it was unfortunate. 17. The Bill of Rights applied to everyone immediately. One of the neatest tricks in U.S. history class is the way teachers move directly from the Bill of Rights being ratified in 1791 to the idea that everyone suddenly had freedom of speech, religion, and due process. The reality is that the Bill of Rights originally restricted only the federal government. States could, and did, violate those rights openly. Several states had official churches well into the 19th century. Southern states used black codes, poll taxes, literacy tests, and all-white primaries to make a mockery of equal protection. It wasn't until the 20th century, through a slow case-by-case process called incorporation, that the Supreme Court began applying most of the Bill of Rights to the states. Freedom of the press, the right to counsel, protection against unreasonable searches, these were extended over decades, often after brutal abuses forced the issue. The comforting myth is instant liberty. The actual story is generations of people dragging the Constitution into their reality. 18. Native Americans had no advanced civilizations. The schoolbook version of pre-Columbian America is often a blank canvas dotted with a few nomadic tribes and simple villages, as if civilization started when Europeans stepped off the boat. Before Columbus, the Americas were home to cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had massive earthen mounds, plazas, and complex social hierarchies. The Mississippian cultures maintained trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built multi-story stone dwellings, engineered irrigation for desert farming, and tracked celestial movements with astronomical precision. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the Northeast created a sophisticated political system with councils and shared governance. Mesoamerican and Andean empires developed writing, advanced mathematics, and intricate road systems. These weren't empty forests waiting for civilization. They were already home to it. 19. The Louisiana Purchase was empty wilderness. The map in the textbook usually shows a huge blank shape labeled Louisiana Purchase, as if Thomas Jefferson had just bought a giant vacant lot from France. The land wasn't empty. It was densely mapped in the minds of the people who actually lived there, dozens of native nations, including the Osage, Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Arapaho, and many more. They had established trade routes, seasonal migration patterns, diplomatic alliances, and rivalries. French and Spanish settlers had already built towns, forts, and plantations along the Mississippi and Gulf Coast. When the U.S. bought the territory in 1803, it didn't acquire unclaimed space. It acquired European claims over indigenous homelands and immediately began the process of pushing, pressuring, and eventually forcing native nations off that land. The purchase price didn't buy emptiness. It bought the legal justification for future removal. 20. Lewis and Clark explored unknown land. The story is usually told like a blank map being filled in by two heroic frontiersmen, bravely hacking their way through untouched wilderness to the Pacific. What Lewis and Clark really did was travel through a continent that was already inhabited, mapped, and understood by native peoples. The Corps of Discovery relied constantly on indigenous guides and translators. Sacagawea's presence helped them negotiate safe passage. They followed existing trails and river routes used for generations for trade. Indigenous hosts provided food, horses, directions, political introductions, and geographic knowledge. When the expedition drew maps, they were often recording information given to them by the people whose territories they were passing through. To Washington, D.C., the land might have been unknown. To the Mandan, Nez Perce, Shoshone, and others, it was home, with place names, stories, and histories Lewis and Clark barely began to grasp. 21. The Alamo was a simple fight for freedom. The way it's usually framed, the Alamo is a straightforward story of noble Texans defending liberty against Mexican tyranny. What gets left out is why many of those Texans were there in the first place and what kind of freedom they were fighting for. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. Anglo-American settlers in the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas brought enslaved people with them and resisted Mexican attempts to enforce abolition. Tensions grew not just over local autonomy, but over immigration policy, land speculation, and the centralizing tendencies of Mexican President Santa Anna. Tejano leaders, Mexican Texans, were divided. Some fought against Santa Anna, others supported the Mexican government. The Texas Revolt was entangled with the desire of Anglo settlers to preserve and expand slavery and to control land without Mexican oversight. The Alamo wasn't just a last stand for abstract liberty. It was a flashpoint in a larger struggle over slavery, sovereignty, and who got to claim the territory as theirs. 22. Manifest destiny was inevitable progress. In school, manifest destiny gets framed like a kind of natural law, as if it were obvious and inevitable that the United States would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That phrase didn't fall from the sky. It was coined in the 1840s by newspaper editor John L. O'Sullivan as a political slogan, a justification. It wrapped expansion in the language of God's will, civilization, and progress, while masking what it really meant: conquest, war, and displacement. Manifest destiny sold the Mexican-American War as righteous and the seizure of indigenous land as ordained. It wasn't destiny. It was marketing for empire. 23. The Trail of Tears was an unavoidable move. Textbooks often describe the Trail of Tears as if it were a sad but necessary relocation, like the government reluctantly moving people for their own safety. The reality is that it was the result of deliberate policy, broken treaties, and relentless pressure for land. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations had treaties recognizing their sovereignty. They had adopted written constitutions, newspapers, schools. None of that stopped the state of Georgia, land-hungry settlers, and President Andrew Jackson from pushing removal. The Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Cherokee rights in Worcester v. Georgia. Jackson ignored it. The forced marches that killed thousands were not a tragic accident of history. They were a political choice. 24. The Wild West was mostly white cowboys. The classic image is always the same. Lone white cowboy on horseback, riding into a dusty town. The real West was way more diverse. After the Civil War, an estimated 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Many were formerly enslaved men who took ranch work because it offered more freedom than sharecropping. Mexican vaqueros had been working cattle long before the U.S. took the Southwest. They invented many of the techniques and gear later claimed as cowboy culture. Indigenous cowhands, Chinese laborers, and mixed heritage communities all shaped frontier life. The West wasn't a white playground. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual region that Hollywood later whitewashed. 25. Cowboys constantly fought showdown gunfights. The iconic noon duel in the middle of Main Street, two men squaring off in total silence, is almost entirely a product of dime novels and movies. Frontier towns definitely had violence, but it looked more like bar fights, ambushes, domestic abuse, and drunken accidents than scripted duels with fair rules. Many towns had stricter gun control than modern cities. Places like Dodge City and Tombstone required visitors to check their weapons when they came into town. Sheriffs and marshals spent more time breaking up brawls and enforcing curfews than overseeing cinematic standoffs. The myth of constant gunfights sells a romantic vision of rugged individualism. The reality was messier, more regulated, and far less glamorous. 26. The gold rush made everyone rich. The story usually goes like this. News of gold at Sutter's Mill spreads, hard-working prospectors stream into California, and ordinary people strike it rich. What actually happened is that a tiny minority of early arrivals found big strikes, and most people who came later barely broke even or went home broke. Many died of disease, accidents, or violence. The people who reliably made money were merchants and corporations, store owners selling tools and food at inflated prices, shipping companies, banks, and land speculators. Levi Strauss got rich selling durable pants, not panning in rivers. Meanwhile, native communities were driven off their lands, massacred and starved as mining operations polluted rivers and destroyed ecosystems. The gold rush was a bonanza for a few, a disaster for many. 27. The Underground Railroad was a literal railroad. The way it's sometimes illustrated, you'd think there were secret trains running under the Mason-Dixon line. The phrases conductors, stations, and routes were metaphors, borrowed from railroad language to keep things coded. The Underground Railroad was a loose, shifting network of people, black and white abolitionists, free black communities, Quakers, church groups, and countless unnamed helpers who hid fugitives, provided food and clothing, forged documents, and guided people north. It was dangerous, illegal work. Enslaved people themselves did most of the planning, risk-taking and escaping, often traveling alone or in small groups, using these networks when they could. There were no tickets, no tracks, no locomotives, just courage, communication, and an underground web of human beings defying the law. 28. The North opposed slavery entirely on moral grounds. Textbooks often draw a clean moral line. The North hated slavery, the South loved it. In reality, many white Northerners opposed the expansion of slavery for economic or political reasons, not because they believed in racial equality. They didn't want to compete with slave labor, or see Southern slaveholders dominate federal power. Free black people in northern states still faced segregated schools, bans on voting, exclusion from juries, and housing discrimination. Some states passed laws restricting black migration. Abolitionists existed and fought hard, but they were a minority for much of the 19th century. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it was as much a wartime strategy as a moral awakening. The North's record isn't a simple story of virtue triumphing over evil. It's a story of mixed motives, racism without slavery, and gradual contested change. 29. The Civil War was not mainly about slavery. You might have been told the war was about states' rights, as if the Confederacy just wanted local control over tariffs and abstract principles. The actual secession documents don't talk in abstractions. They talk about slavery. Mississippi's declaration flatly says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." South Carolina, Georgia, Texas all spelled out that their economy and social order depended on enslaved labor, and that they were leaving because the federal government might restrict or threaten it. The right they were fighting for was the right to own human beings. States' rights was the rebranding. Slavery was the engine. 30. Most Southerners owned slaves. Another twist you may have heard, that practically every white Southerner had a plantation and human property, as if the whole region was evenly invested. In reality, only about a quarter of white Southern households owned any enslaved people at all, and large plantations with dozens or hundreds of enslaved workers were an even smaller slice. But that minority held enormous wealth and political power. They shaped laws, controlled state governments, and dominated Congress. Poor and non-slaveholding whites were pulled into defending slavery anyway, through race-based propaganda, promises of future ownership, and fears of black equality. A small elite owned the people, a much larger group defended the system. 31. Abraham Lincoln wanted full racial equality from the start. School often turns Lincoln into a kind of fully formed civil rights icon from day one. The real Lincoln was complicated, cautious, and evolving. Early in his career, he opposed the spread of slavery but accepted it where it already existed. He floated colonization schemes to resettle black Americans outside the U.S. He made openly racist remarks that reflected the views of many white Northerners. What changed him wasn't a sudden moral lightning bolt. It was war, politics, and relentless pressure from black abolitionists, soldiers, and activists who pushed for emancipation and citizenship. By the end of his life, Lincoln was advocating limited black voting rights and praising black troops. He grew. He didn't start where we like to remember him. 32. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all enslaved people instantly. The famous date, January 1, 1863, gets presented like a magic switch. Lincoln signs a piece of paper, chains fall off everywhere, the end. The actual document was narrower. It applied only to enslaved people in areas in rebellion against the United States. It specifically exempted the loyal border states Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and some Union-occupied parts of the Confederacy. It was as much a military measure as a moral one, designed to weaken the Confederacy and encourage escapes. Freedom depended on Union armies advancing and enforcing it. In places like Texas, people remained enslaved until federal troops arrived and announced emancipation in 1865. The proclamation was a crucial step, but it wasn't a universal, immediate liberation. 33. The Civil War ended slavery everywhere overnight. Even after Appomattox, slavery didn't just vanish on its own. Some enslavers refused to acknowledge defeat and clung to forced labor as long as they could. The legal foundation for ending slavery nationwide came later, with the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865. It abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, a loophole that would be exploited through convict leasing and mass incarceration. Even then, enforcement was uneven. In some regions, former enslavers used violence, black codes, and debt peonage to keep people effectively unfree. The war shattered the Confederacy and crippled slavery, but the system adapted. Ending legal slavery was a process, not an on-off switch. 34. Reconstruction was a failure because black government was corrupt. If you learned that Reconstruction was a tragic experiment where inexperienced black politicians ruined Southern states, you learned the story written by the people who overthrew them. After the war, multiracial governments formed across the South. They built public schools, expanded voting rights, and rewrote state constitutions. White supremacists hated this. They responded with propaganda and terror. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan used lynchings, massacres, and intimidation to drive black voters from the polls. At the same time, pro-Confederate writers launched a historical rewrite, depicting Reconstruction governments as ignorant and corrupt simply because black people participated. Some corruption existed, like in every government, but the failure narrative was crafted to justify violent overthrow and a return to white rule, not to describe reality. 35. Reconstruction gave freed people lasting protection. The textbooks sometimes wrap this era up with a neat bow. The war ended, amendments passed, Reconstruction happened, and then America moved forward. The actual arc is closer to whiplash. During early Reconstruction, federal troops and laws offered some real protection. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights. Black communities built schools, churches, businesses, and political organizations. But white Northern commitment faded fast. In 1877, a backroom political deal ended federal military occupation of the South. The government effectively walked away. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, imposed poll taxes and literacy tests, and looked the other way as mobs terrorized black citizens. The Supreme Court gutted civil rights protections. Within a generation, much of the promise of Reconstruction had been stripped away. The laws stayed on paper, the protections did not. 36. The Ku Klux Klan was a marginal fringe group. In school, the Klan might show up as a few lunatics in white hoods, a hate group everyone despised and ignored. In reality, the Klan operated more like a shadow government, more than once. The first Klan in the 1860s and 70s waged organized terror across the South to destroy Reconstruction, burning schools, murdering black office holders, attacking anyone who supported multiracial democracy. Federal troops eventually crushed that version, but it wasn't the end. In the 1910s and 20s, a second Klan exploded nationwide. It wasn't just in backwoods towns, it marched in Washington, D.C., elected governors, senators, mayors, school board members. Millions joined. Local police, judges, and ministers were often members. The Klan wasn't fringe. It was mainstream white supremacy in costume. 37. Plessy v. Ferguson created truly equal separate facilities. The phrase separate but equal sounds almost reasonable when you hear it in a textbook, like the Supreme Court tried to split the difference and treat people fairly. On the ground, equal was a legal fig leaf. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 gave states a green light to enforce segregation in trains, schools, hospitals, parks, and just about every public space. White lawmakers then deliberately starved black institutions of money. Black schools got hand-me-down textbooks, dilapidated buildings, underpaid teachers. Public facilities for black people were often shacks, side entrances, or nothing at all. Courts mostly shrugged. The inequality wasn't an accident, it was the point. Separate but equal was a slogan used to maintain racial hierarchy and give it a veneer of legality. 38. Ellis Island welcomed all immigrants equally. The romantic version of Ellis Island is a non-stop montage of hopeful families, a quick name change, and instant American dreams. The actual process was a sorting line, and not everyone got through. Inspectors examined people for disease, disability, pregnancy, and signs of poverty. Those who looked likely to become a public charge could be sent back at their own expense. Medical exams were rushed and often crude. People with trachoma, tuberculosis, or visible disabilities were detained or deported. Race and nationality shaped outcomes too. Asian immigrants were largely barred by separate exclusion laws. Anarchists, socialists, and suspected radicals were turned away or jailed. Ellis Island wasn't a pure symbol of welcome. It was a gatekeeping machine, enforcing a hierarchy of who was fit to become American. 39. The Statue of Liberty always symbolized open borders. You probably know the poem about tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, as if the Statue of Liberty has always stood for unlimited immigration. That famous poem by Emma Lazarus wasn't even part of the original monument. It was added later, and U.S. policy often made a mockery of the words. While liberty faced the Atlantic, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first major law banning a specific ethnic group from immigrating. In the 1920s, the U.S. imposed strict quotas favoring Northern Europeans and slamming the door on many others, including Jews fleeing rising fascism. During World War II, ships of refugees were turned away. The statue's image sold a story of openness, while the laws repeatedly narrowed the definition of who deserved to enter. 40. Industrial titans were pure self-made heroes. The stories of men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan usually get told as inspirational biographies. Poor kids who worked hard, innovated, and rose to the top. Hard work played a role, but so did ruthless tactics and government help. These robber barons crushed competitors through predatory pricing, secret railroad rebates, and hostile takeovers. They formed trusts to choke off competition and control entire industries: oil, steel, railroads, finance. Workers labored long hours in dangerous conditions for low pay, while the owners accumulated fortunes larger than some countries' budgets. When laborers organized, companies hired private armies or called in state militias to break strikes, sometimes with lethal violence. Courts often sided with the corporations. The myth of the lone genius ignores the web of monopoly power and political favoritism that made those empires possible. 41. Child labor was a necessary stage of progress. Textbooks sometimes treat child labor as an unfortunate but inevitable step in industrialization. Kids working in mills and mines until the economy got richer and laws naturally improved. Nothing about it was automatic. Children as young as 5 and 6 worked 12-hour shifts in textile factories, coal mines, canneries, and glassworks. They lost fingers to machines, lungs to dust, lives to accidents. Families depended on their wages because adult pay was kept deliberately low. Business owners lobbied hard against restrictions, arguing that regulation would ruin the economy. Change came because reformers, unions, journalists, and survivors fought for it, exposing conditions with photographs, pushing states to pass minimum age laws, and finally winning federal protections in the 1930s. Child labor didn't fade away on its own. It was dragged out of the system, inch by inch. 42. The Gilded Age was prosperity for all. The very name Gilded Age can sound shiny and prosperous, as if the late 1800s were a golden time when trains were built, fortunes were made, and everyone's boat rose with the tide. The gilded part meant something else, a thin layer of gold over something much rougher. Yes, there were mansions, grand hotels, and lavish parties for the wealthy. At the same time, millions lived in crowded tenements with no indoor plumbing, clean water, or sanitation. Factories and mines chewed through workers who could be killed or maimed with little compensation. Strikes were met with police clubs, militia rifles, and company guards. Corruption was rampant in city machines and national politics. Wealth concentrated at the top while the majority scraped by. The era wasn't broadly golden. It was glitter on top of deep inequality. 43. Labor unions were just violent troublemakers. If you heard about unions at all, it was probably as mobs blocking factory gates and throwing rocks, something teachers summarized as labor unrest. What gets lost is why people risked their lives to form unions in the first place. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, 10 to 14-hour days were normal. Safety rules were minimal. If you lost an arm in a machine, you were usually just fired. Coal miners breathed dust until their lungs failed. Railroad workers died by the thousands. Unions fought for basics: an 8-hour day, safer conditions, higher wages, weekends. The violence in many famous strikes came from police, private detectives, and even federal troops called in to protect company property. At Homestead, at Pullman, at Ludlow, workers were shot, beaten, and evicted. Textbooks often paint Union violence without mentioning the corporate armies pointed at them. 44. The Spanish-American War freed Cuba selflessly. The high school version goes something like this. The USS Maine exploded. Americans cried, "Remember the Maine," and the United States nobly liberated Cuba from cruel Spanish rule. What slips out of the narrative is how quickly that liberation turned into empire. Even before the war, American business leaders and politicians eyed Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as strategic footholds and new markets. After defeating Spain in 1898, the U.S. forced Cuba to accept the Platt Amendment, giving Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and securing a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Puerto Rico became an American possession, not an independent nation. The U.S. annexed Guam and bought the Philippines. American troops stayed, governed, and profited. The war was sold to the public as humanitarian rescue. On paper and on the ground, it looked a lot more like imperial expansion. 45. The Philippines welcomed U.S. rule. The story often goes the U.S. took the Philippines from Spain, the Filipinos were grateful, and America mentored them toward democracy. The reality was a brutal, largely forgotten war. Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had already been fighting Spain for independence. When the U.S. decided to keep the islands instead of recognizing that independence, Filipinos resisted. The Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902 killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, many from disease and famine triggered by the conflict. American generals used tactics like reconcentration camps, scorched earth campaigns, and torture methods such as the water cure. Entire villages were burned for suspected guerrilla support. U.S. troops called it the Filipino insurrection, as if they were putting down a riot instead of suppressing a national independence movement. Textbooks might give it a paragraph. For people in the Philippines, it was a war of occupation. 46. America stayed isolationist before World War I. You might have learned that the US mostly kept to itself until 1917, a peaceful giant reluctantly dragged into European chaos. But isolationist doesn't really apply to a country already stretching military and economic power across the globe. By the early 1900s, the US had taken Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and controlled the Panama Canal Zone. Marines landed repeatedly in Central America and the Caribbean to protect American investments. Banks and corporations extended credit and influence deep into Latin America and beyond. The US Navy projected power on two oceans. American diplomats pushed trade agreements and open-door policies in China. At home, the economy was deeply tied to European markets. Isolation meant staying out of European alliances, not staying out of other people's countries. The US was already behaving like a global empire long before the first American soldier reached the Western Front. 47. World War I made the world safe for democracy. Woodrow Wilson's soaring slogan about making the world safe for democracy sounds noble on a test. It sounds different when you look at what happened. At home, the US government passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, criminalizing criticism of the war. People were jailed for speeches, pamphlets, even anti-war songs. Socialist leader Eugene Debs got 10 years in prison for a speech. The post office banned disloyal publications. The government created the first large-scale propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information, to manage public opinion. Surveillance of radicals, immigrants, and dissidents expanded. Abroad, the peace settlement carved up empires but handed territories to new imperial powers instead of granting real self-rule. Colonized peoples who heard self-determination discovered it mostly didn't apply to them. The war didn't usher in a stable democratic era. It left bitterness, authoritarian crackdowns, and a path toward the next global catastrophe. 48. Women won suffrage in 1920 for all women. The textbook version tends to wrap women's voting rights into a tidy ending. The 19th Amendment passed. Women could vote, story complete. But women in that sentence mostly meant white women. Black women in the South still faced poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright terror when they tried to register. Native American women often couldn't vote because many Native people weren't considered U.S. citizens until 1924, and even then, states found ways to block them for decades. Asian American women ran into citizenship barriers and exclusion laws. Puerto Rican women got limited suffrage in 1929 and full voting rights later, under different rules. Even within the suffrage movement, some white leaders sidelined black activists and courted Southern support by reassuring segregationists. So yes, 1920 was a major milestone, but it was the beginning of a longer, uneven fight, not the finish line. 49. The Roaring Twenties were prosperous for everyone. The Roaring Twenties usually show up in classes: jazz, flappers, stock market booms, and shiny consumer goods. It looks like a decade-long party. Beneath the glitter, prosperity was deeply uneven. Farmers faced falling crop prices and crushing debt. Many lost their land. Industrial workers saw some gains but still endured long hours and precarious jobs, easily fired when business slowed. Labor unions were weakened by crackdowns and open shop campaigns. Black Americans in the South remained locked into sharecropping and Jim Crow. In northern cities, they met housing segregation, job discrimination, and violent backlashes like the 1919 Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe faced quotas and suspicion. While some people bought cars and radios on credit, others lived one paycheck from disaster. When the stock market crashed in 1929, it exposed how many had never been securely roaring at all. 50. The stock market crash alone caused the Great Depression. The way it's usually told, everything was fine until October 1929. The market crashed, people panicked, banks failed, and boom, Great Depression. Reality is slower, uglier, and more structural. The crash was a trigger, not the only cause. All through the 1920s, wealth piled up at the top while wages for most workers lagged behind. That meant lots of production, not enough purchasing power. People bridged the gap with debt, installment plans, margin loans, mortgages stretched thin. Banks were barely regulated, deposits weren't insured, and thousands of small banks made risky loans tied to the boom. When the market fell, it exposed how fragile everything already was. Bank failures wiped out savings. Businesses cut wages and laid off workers, which reduced demand even more, which led to more failures. Internationally, war debts and reparations tangled the U.S. to a shaky global system. Weak monetary policy, budget cuts, and a refusal to stimulate the economy all deepened the crisis. It wasn't just a bad week on Wall Street. It was a decades-long house of cards finally collapsing. 51. Herbert Hoover did nothing during the Depression. School often casts Hoover as a cartoon villain of inaction, a president who sat on his hands while people starved in Hoovervilles. The truth is more uncomfortable. He did a lot by the standards of earlier presidents, but much of it was too little, too late, and based on the wrong ideas. Hoover believed in balancing the budget, voluntary cooperation, and keeping federal government small. So he pressured business leaders not to cut wages. He encouraged local charities and state governments to handle relief. He increased spending on public works like the Boulder, later Hoover Dam. In 1932, he helped create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks, railroads, and big businesses. In Washington, those looked like bold steps. On the ground, families were lining up at soup kitchens, riding freight trains in search of work, and watching farms seized in foreclosure. Hoover's reluctance to give direct aid to individuals, and his decision to raise taxes and tariffs in the middle of an economic collapse made things worse. It wasn't that nothing was done. It's that the government aimed its help upward and trusted prosperity would trickle down, while millions at the bottom were already underwater. 52. The New Deal ended the Great Depression by itself. The school version tends to go, Hoover failed, FDR came in with the New Deal, problem solved. Reality was messier, bumpier, and took longer than the neat timeline suggests. The New Deal did transform the relationship between Americans and their government. It created Social Security, unemployment insurance, bank deposit insurance, minimum wage laws, and public works programs like the CCC and WPA that put millions to work. It regulated Wall Street, supported labor organizing, and provided relief to desperate families. Those changes mattered. They stabilized the system and eased suffering. But unemployment in the late 1930s still hovered in the double digits. When FDR tried to cut spending in 1937, the economy slid back into a sharp recession. What finally brought full employment and massive industrial output wasn't just alphabet agencies, it was World War II. Wartime mobilization pumped unprecedented government money into factories, shipyards, and research labs. The draft and war production absorbed millions of unemployed workers. The New Deal laid crucial groundwork, protections, infrastructure, and institutions that shaped mid-century life. But the story that it alone fixed the Depression erases the role of a total war economy and makes government reform look more omnipotent than it really was. 53. The New Deal helped all Americans equally. It's often portrayed as a generous safety net spreading evenly across the country, everyone lifted together. But who benefited, and by how much, was shaped by race, region, and local politics. Social Security, for example, originally excluded agricultural and domestic workers, jobs heavily held by Black workers in the South, and by Mexican and Filipino laborers in the West and Southwest. That wasn't an accident. Southern congressmen wanted to protect low-wage systems and racial hierarchies, and they held key committee power. Many relief and jobs programs were administered by local officials who enforced segregation and discrimination. Black families received smaller checks, were steered into the lowest-paying WPA jobs, or were denied access entirely. Public housing projects often reinforced racial segregation in cities, not eased it. Some programs, like the GI Bill later on, were technically race-neutral on paper, but deeply unequal in practice because of racist banks, colleges, and housing markets. White workers, especially in the North, still gained enormously from the New Deal. But for many Black, Latino, Asian American, and Native communities, it was a split reality. Some new opportunities, some hard exclusions, and a federal government that often deferred to Jim Crow rather than challenging it. 54. Prohibition failed because Americans love crime. Textbooks usually condense prohibition into a morality tale. Moralists banned alcohol. Everyone drank anyway. Gangsters got rich. The law failed. Lesson learned. Underneath the speakeasies and bootleggers was a fierce clash of cultures. Prohibition grew out of temperance movements tied to Protestant reformers, rural and small town values, women worried about domestic violence, and employers who wanted sober workers. It was also deeply tangled with anti-immigrant sentiment, targeting drinking cultures associated with German, Irish, Italian, and Eastern European communities, and with suspicion of Catholic and Jewish saloons. For some, banning alcohol was about public health and family stability. For others, it was about controlling the behavior of the urban poor and immigrants. Enforcement fell hardest on working-class neighborhoods and communities of color, while wealthy people often found discreet ways around the rules. Organized crime absolutely expanded with bootlegging, but so did police corruption and political hypocrisy. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it wasn't simply because Americans love crime. It was because the law exposed class, ethnic, religious, and regional tensions, and the attempt to legislate one group's moral code onto everyone else collapsed under its own contradictions. 55. Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise to everyone. The way it's often told, Americans were happily neutral. Then out of nowhere Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shocking the nation into war. It makes for a clean before and after moment. The real lead-up was years of rising tension. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931, expanded into China, and pushed toward Southeast Asia. The U.S. responded with embargoes on oil and other materials, froze Japanese assets, and moved the Pacific Fleet to Hawaii as a deterrent. American, British, and Dutch officials expected some kind of clash in the Pacific. U.S. codebreakers were already reading portions of Japanese diplomatic traffic. Warnings circulated that an attack somewhere was likely, but not exactly where or when. Many U.S. leaders assumed the first blow would be in the Philippines or British Malaya, not Hawaii. Intelligence was fragmented, riddled with assumptions, and mishandled by multiple offices. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical surprise, not a bolt from a peaceful blue sky. Officials knew conflict with Japan was approaching. They just misread the target and the timing, and thousands of sailors and soldiers paid the price for those miscalculations. 56. World War II was fought only overseas because classroom maps focus on Europe and the Pacific. It's easy to imagine World War II as something over there, with American life largely united and untouched. In reality, the war rearranged daily life inside the U.S. on a massive scale. The government drafted over 10 million men and sent them to training camps across the country. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, building planes, ships, and munitions. War jobs pulled millions of people from rural areas to booming industrial cities, and from the south to the north and west, reshaping the country's demographics. Federal agencies rationed gasoline, sugar, meat, rubber. People collected scrap metal and planted victory gardens because consumer goods disappeared into the war effort. Surveillance expanded. The FBI monitored dissent, censored mail, and watched labor organizers and suspected radicals. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were rounded up and imprisoned in camps without trial, losing homes and businesses. Mexican and Caribbean workers were recruited through guest worker programs to fill labor shortages, while race riots broke out in cities like Detroit and Los Angeles. Shipyards, research labs, and bases transformed local economies. The battlefields were abroad, but the war state, its controls, migrations, and inequalities was built at home. 57. Japanese-American internment was a military necessity. The official line at the time was simple: we had to do it. After Pearl Harbor, military commanders and politicians claimed they couldn't risk Japanese Americans sabotaging the war effort on the West Coast. So more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were forced from their homes and imprisoned in camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Textbooks often framed this as an unfortunate overreaction in a time of crisis, but military necessity was mostly a cover for racism and hysteria. There was no evidence of widespread disloyalty or sabotage. The FBI and naval intelligence had already investigated Japanese American communities and reported they were largely loyal. Those reports were ignored. White farmers and business owners helped push for removal, eager to take over Japanese American land in competition. German and Italian Americans were not rounded up en masse. Only Japanese ancestry triggered mass incarceration. Decades later, government commissions admitted the truth. The camps were driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, not by any proven threat. 58. Rosie the Riveter ended workplace sexism. The posters show Rosie flexing her arms, saying, "We can do it." The story goes that World War II finally shattered gender barriers, women rushed into factories, and sexism crumbled. Then everyone lived progressively ever after. Reality was more transactional. With millions of men drafted, the government and industry desperately needed workers. So they launched campaigns encouraging women to take men's jobs as welders, riveters, machinists. Wages went up, childcare centers opened near plants, and some women, especially white, married and previously middle class, entered paid industrial work for the first time. But the idea was never permanent equality. It was step in until the war is over. When victory came, employers and government propaganda shifted overnight. Women were told their patriotic duty was now to leave the factory, go home, make room for returning soldiers, and be domestic again. Many were laid off. Those who stayed were pushed back into lower-paid, feminine jobs. Black and Latina women, who had often been stuck in the hardest, worst-paid work even before the war, faced both racial and gender discrimination on the job and in the post-war layoffs. Rosie didn't end workplace sexism. She showed how quickly women's labor could be mobilized and then just as quickly shoved back into the margins. 59. The United States entered World War II as a perfect defender of freedom. The narrative is clean. Fascist dictators threatened liberty, and America, beacon of democracy, rose to defend freedom worldwide. That framing leaves out what freedom actually looked like inside the US in 1941. The country still had legal segregation across the South and in many northern institutions. Jim Crow laws dictated where Black Americans could live, work, go to school, sit on a bus, or cast a vote, if they could vote at all. Lynchings and racist violence went largely unpunished. Indigenous communities lived under policies of forced assimilation and dispossession. Asian immigrants faced long-standing exclusion laws. When the war began, the government claimed to fight for democracy while interning Japanese Americans without trial and keeping the military itself strictly segregated. Black soldiers trained in separate facilities, served mostly in menial roles, and faced violence in uniform. The FBI and other agencies expanded surveillance and censorship, cracking down on radicals, labor organizers, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. None of this means the fight against fascism wasn't real or important. It means the arsenal of democracy was also a country denying full democracy to millions of its own people while telling the world it was the pure embodiment of freedom. 60. The atomic bombings were the only way to end the war. In many textbooks, the story is presented as a grim but straightforward equation: drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or face 1 million American casualties in a land invasion of Japan. With those stakes, the decision is framed as inevitable and morally clear. Historians, generals, and officials at the time were far less unanimous. By summer 1945, Japan's Navy and Air Force were shattered, its cities devastated by conventional bombing, its population starving under blockade. Some top U.S. military leaders, including Eisenhower and Admiral Leahy, later said they believed Japan was already on the brink of surrender. The Soviet Union had promised to enter the war against Japan, and did so on August 8, 1945, between the two atomic bombings, an event that shocked Japanese leaders and threatened their last hope of negotiating through Moscow. Other options were discussed: modifying surrender terms to allow the emperor to remain as figurehead, demonstrating the bomb on an uninhabited area, or waiting to see the impact of Soviet entry. Supporters of the bombings argued anything less risked prolonging the war and costing more lives, including Japanese civilians. Critics argued the real target was also geopolitical, intimidating the USSR at the dawn of the Cold War. The truth is not that there was one obvious path. It's that the US chose a path that instantly killed over 100,000 civilians and left generations living with radiation, all while other possibilities, imperfect and uncertain, still existed. 61. The Cold War was a simple good versus evil struggle. In the simplified version, the Cold War is a moral drama. The free world versus totalitarian communism, America as the good guy containing Soviet expansion. When you zoom in, it looks much less like a superhero movie and more like a global tangle of coups, propaganda, and bargains with brutal regimes. The US absolutely opposed Soviet domination in Europe, but it also toppled democratically elected governments in places like Iran, Guatemala, and Chile, because they threatened corporate interests or leaned left. It armed and trained security forces in countries that tortured and disappeared dissidents so long as they were anti-communist. The Soviet Union crushed uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The US backed dictators in South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, the Congo, and more. Both superpowers ran propaganda campaigns, funded front organizations, and interfered in foreign media and elections. Nuclear weapons loomed over everything, with each side justifying their arsenals as defensive. Many movements around the world tried to carve out independent paths, non-aligned nations, anti-colonial struggles, but were forced to navigate or suffer under this binary. The Cold War was not a clean battle of good ideologies versus evil ones. It was a long period where both sides talked about freedom and justice while repeatedly sacrificing both in the name of strategy. 62. McCarthy personally created the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy is usually portrayed as the villain who single-handedly plunged America into a paranoid hunt for communists in the early 1950s. He waved papers, ruined careers, and gave his name to McCarthyism, but the fear and repression he exploited were already decades old. The first Red Scare erupted right after World War I, with the Palmer raids, mass arrests of radicals, deportations, and laws criminalizing subversive speech. During the 1930s and 1940s, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover built extensive files on leftists, labor organizers, civil rights activists, and anyone linked to the Communist Party. Loyalty oaths and blacklists existed before McCarthy's famous speeches. The House Un-American Activities Committee was grilling Hollywood writers and actors while he was still relatively unknown. McCarthy's talent was tapping into this existing machinery and media appetite. He made wild, unsubstantiated claims about communists in the State Department and the Army, grabbing headlines and terrifying officials. But the broader system that enabled blacklisting, loyalty investigations, and surveillance extended far beyond one senator. Even after McCarthy was censured by the Senate in 1954 and his influence collapsed, the FBI kept spying, HUAC kept working, and anti-communist laws stayed on the books. Blaming it all on McCarthy turns a deep, structural climate of fear into the story of one bad man, which is much more comforting and much less accurate. 63. The 1950s were a calm golden age. Nostalgia paints the 1950s as a simpler, happier time, tidy suburbs, stable jobs, big cars, and wholesome families gathered around the television. Sometimes history class echoes that mood, presenting the decade as peaceful and prosperous between the turmoil of World War II and the upheavals of the 1960s. Beneath the pastel surface, the 1950s were tense. Legally enforced segregation and violent racism still ruled much of the country. The Montgomery bus boycott, Brown v. Board of Education, and the violent backlash to desegregation all happened in this supposedly calm era. Women were pushed back into domestic roles after wartime work, told fulfillment only came through marriage and motherhood, even as many quietly sought jobs or education. Gay, lesbian, and queer people lived under constant threat of police raids, firings, and psychiatric treatments. Conformity was heavily policed in fashion, politics, religion, even hobbies. At the same time, nuclear anxiety hung over everything. Children practiced duck and cover drills in case of atomic attack. Families built fallout shelters. The US and USSR raced to build bigger bombs, and each crisis, Berlin, Korea, carried the possibility of annihilation. For some white middle-class Americans, the 1950s felt stable. For many others, it was an age of pressure, exclusion, and looming catastrophe wrapped in the language of normalcy. 64. Suburbia was open to all returning veterans. After World War II, the story goes, the GI Bill and booming suburbs opened the American dream to every returning soldier. Buy a house, build equity, send your kids to college. History class often presents this as a colorblind success story. The reality was racially engineered. The GI Bill itself didn't explicitly say whites only, but it was administered through local banks, colleges, and housing authorities steeped in Jim Crow. The Federal Housing Administration literally drew red lines on maps, marking black neighborhoods as risky and refusing to insure mortgages there. Developers of new suburbs, like Levittown, wrote deeds that banned selling homes to black families. White veterans got low-interest loans and access to appreciating property. Black veterans were often denied loans outright, or steered into overcrowded, neglected urban housing. Over time, that meant generational wealth for many white families and generational exclusion for many black ones. Suburbia wasn't a neutral landscape, it was a racially gated investment plan. 65. Brown v. Board immediately desegregated schools. Textbooks love that triumphant moment in 1954. The Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board of Education that separate but equal is unconstitutional. Cue the swelling music, and then segregation just sort of dissolves. But Brown didn't flip a switch. The court's follow-up decision in 1955 told districts to desegregate, with all deliberate speed, which many Southern officials interpreted as slowly as humanly possible. States passed massive resistance laws. Governors shut down entire public school systems rather than integrate them, as in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where schools for black children were closed for years. White citizens' councils formed to intimidate families and pressure officials. Some districts drew new attendance zones to keep schools effectively segregated. Even where desegregation orders took effect, black teachers lost jobs, black schools were closed, and black students were buzzed into hostile environments. In many parts of the country, serious integration didn't begin until the late 1960s or 1970s, and courts have since allowed resegregation. Brown was a critical decision, but it wasn't a magic wand. It was the opening shot in a very long, very contested struggle. 66. Rosa Parks was just a tired seamstress. The popular story is simple. An ordinary woman, exhausted after a long day of work, spontaneously refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery in 1955. Her quiet courage sparked the civil rights movement. The truth is more strategic and more powerful. Rosa Parks was indeed a seamstress, but she was also a seasoned activist, secretary of the local NAACP, an investigator of racial violence cases, including the rape of black women by white men. She had attended trainings at the Highlander Folk School, where organizers discussed nonviolent resistance and bus segregation. Civil rights leaders in Montgomery had been looking for the right test case to challenge bus laws. Parks had a spotless reputation, a long record of activism, and understood the stakes. When she refused to give up her seat, it wasn't just fatigue, it was a calculated act of resistance backed by a community, ready to organize. The Montgomery bus boycott that followed was coordinated, disciplined, and lasted over a year. Calling her just a tired seamstress erases the years of organizing and planning that made that moment possible. 67. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream and nothing more. In school, you usually meet King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, delivering one carefully edited speech about racial harmony and little black and white children holding hands. Then he's assassinated, and the story ends. Missing are the years where King became a fierce critic of war, capitalism, and American foreign policy. By the mid-1960s, he wasn't just talking about lunch counters and buses. He was talking about slums, unemployment, and what he called the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. In 1967, he publicly condemned the Vietnam War, calling the U.S. the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He argued that true justice required a radical redistribution of economic power and organized the Poor People's Campaign to demand jobs, housing, and income support for all races. These positions made him deeply unpopular with many white Americans and with the government. His approval ratings plummeted. Newspapers and politicians denounced him. Reducing King to a single, softened dream speech turns a radical critic of American power into a harmless icon of vague niceness. 68. The civil rights movement was nonviolent and universally loved. Textbooks tend to show a highlight reel, peaceful marches, inspiring speeches, dignified sit-ins, and then, almost inevitably, legislative victory. The impression is that nonviolence melted hearts and America applauded. In reality, nonviolent protest was met with batons, fire hoses, attack dogs, bombs, and bullets. Activists were beaten on freedom rides, jailed for registering to vote, murdered on rural roads. The FBI spied on them, infiltrated organizations, and tried to blackmail their leaders. Opinion polls at the time show that most white Americans disapproved of sit-ins, marches, and demonstrations, calling them too extreme or pushing too fast. Cities erupted in riots after years of police brutality and poverty, and many white commentators blamed the movement itself. Even after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act passed, there was fierce backlash. white flight, tough on crime politics, and the growth of mass incarceration. The movement's nonviolence was a tactical and moral choice, not a sign that everyone liked what they were doing. It worked in part because it exposed how much violence the status quo was willing to use to keep things the same. 69. The Voting Rights Act solved voter suppression permanently. The way it's often told, 1965 is the happy ending. Marchers are beaten in Selma, the nation is shocked. The Voting Rights Act passes, and the ballot box opens forever. The act was monumental. It outlawed literacy tests and poll taxes, sent federal examiners to register voters, and required states with a history of discrimination to get federal pre-clearance before changing their voting laws. Black registration soared in the Deep South, but the people who had designed the old barriers didn't just go home. They adapted. They shifted to at-large voting systems, gerrymandered districts, purged voter rolls, moved or reduced polling places in black and brown communities, and imposed new ID requirements that disproportionately affected poor and minority voters. Then, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted a key part of the act in Shelby County v. Holder, effectively ending preclearance. Within hours and days, states rushed through restrictive voting laws that had been previously blocked. Long lines, strict ID rules, limited early voting, and felony disenfranchisement all kept shaping who could vote. The Voting Rights Act was a powerful tool, not a permanent cure. And like any tool, it can be blunted or taken away. 70. Malcolm X preached only hatred. In the simplified story, Malcolm X is King's angry opposite, a militant who hated white people and preached violence while King preached love and peace. That caricature makes Malcolm easy to dismiss and makes the movement seem neatly divided. Malcolm's early rhetoric as a minister for the Nation of Islam was sharp and uncompromising. He called out white supremacy as a global system and rejected the idea that black people should patiently wait for rights. He defended self-defense against racist attacks, which many white observers equated with violence, but his thinking was never static. After breaking with the Nation of Islam and making the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, he wrote about seeing Muslims of all colors worship together and began talking more about human rights, international solidarity, and building alliances. He didn't abandon his critique of racism or his insistence on black dignity, but he broadened his vision beyond American racial binaries. By the time he was assassinated in 1965, he was exploring cooperation with other civil rights leaders and anti-colonial movements. Reducing him to hate erases a complex evolution and the uncomfortable truths he forced America to confront. 71. The Black Panthers were just an armed gang. That's the image you usually get. Black men in leather jackets with guns. A scary militant group that terrified white Americans and had to be crushed. The story stops there because the rest of it makes the government look worse. The Black Panther Party absolutely believed in armed self-defense against police brutality. They legally carried weapons, monitored police stops, and quoted California gun laws better than most lawyers. But they also built one of the most ambitious community service networks of the era. Panthers ran free breakfast programs that fed tens of thousands of children before school. They opened health clinics that offered testing for sickle cell anemia, free medical care, and education. They organized free clothing drives, senior escort services, legal aid, and even liberation schools. The FBI called these survival programs the greatest threat the Panthers posed because they won people's loyalty. So textbooks highlight the guns and skip the groceries, clinics, and classrooms. 72. The feminist movement spoke for all women equally. In the textbook version, women rise up in the 1960s and 70s as one unified bloc, burning bras, demanding equal pay, winning Roe v. Wade, breaking into the workforce. Feminism is presented as a single wave lifting all boats. But mainstream second-wave feminism was often led by and centered around white, middle-class, college-educated women. Their core issues, access to professional careers, breaking the glass ceiling, suburban housewife dissatisfaction, didn't always match what working-class women or women of color named as their most urgent struggles. Black, Chicana, Native, Asian American, and poor women pointed out that they were already working, often in low-paid, exploitative jobs, and were dealing with racism, police violence, sterilization abuse, and welfare cuts. Groups like the Combahee River Collective explicitly criticized racism and class bias within feminism, arguing for an intersectional approach long before that word got popular. Textbooks tend to smooth over these conflicts, turning a messy, contested movement into a single, sanitized narrative. 73. Stonewall instantly won gay rights. The story tends to go like this. In 1969, the police raid the Stonewall Inn in New York. The patrons fight back. Riots break out, and overnight, gay liberation sweeps the country. Then, somehow, everything gets better. Stonewall was a pivotal uprising led largely by drag queens, trans women, homeless queer youth, and people of color who were sick of constant raids, beatings, and arrests. It did ignite a new wave of organizing, the formation of gay liberation fronts, the first pride marches, a shift from quiet accommodation to loud confrontation. But legal and social change was grindingly slow. Homosexuality remained classified as a mental disorder until 1973. Sodomy laws stayed on the books in many states until 2003. People lost jobs, housing, and custody of their kids for being gay. Police harassment continued. The AIDS crisis in the 1980s wiped out a generation while the government shrugged. Stonewall lit a fuse. It didn't end the fight. 74. The Vietnam War was widely supported until the end. You might hear that Americans were mostly behind the war, and only turned against it when things went obviously wrong, after the Tet Offensive, or when body bags piled up on TV. That makes dissent sound like a late, emotional overreaction instead of what it was, a deep, steady challenge from the beginning. Early on, there were already critics in Congress, the press, and the military warning this was a colonial war in a nationalist disguise. By the mid-1960s, protests were spreading across college campuses, but also in black churches, union halls, and small-town main streets. Clergy organized anti-war sermons and draft counseling. Parents marched with pictures of their sons. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. denounced the war as racist and immoral. Active duty soldiers circulated underground newspapers, refused orders, and threw medals over the White House fence. By the early 1970s, polls showed a majority of Americans believed the war had been a mistake while it was still being fought. 75. The Gulf of Tonkin incident clearly justified escalation. In class, you might get the official version. In August 1964, North Vietnamese boats attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson, with no choice, asks Congress for authority to respond. Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and the war ramps up, open and shut self-defense. Except decades later, declassified documents and recordings showed that the story was, at best, heavily massaged. There was indeed a clash on August 2nd, but the supposed second attack on August 4th almost certainly never happened. Confused radar readings, bad communications, and jittery sailors turned phantom blips into torpedoes. Johnson privately joked that those dumb, stupid sailors were just shooting at flying fish, while publicly insisting America had been the victim of unprovoked aggression. The administration exaggerated and distorted the events to rush Congress into granting broad war powers without a formal declaration. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution became a blank check for full-scale intervention, built partly on an incident that didn't occur. 76. The anti-war movement was mostly draft dodgers. The stereotype is lazy, privileged college kids growing their hair out, burning draft cards, and trying to avoid service while everyone else did their duty. That image makes it easy to dismiss the movement as selfish and unpatriotic. In reality, the anti-war movement was sprawling and diverse. Yes, students played a high-profile role, but so did clergy organizing moral resistance, nuns blocking draft board offices, and parents refusing to let recruiters into schools. Black activists linked Vietnam to racism at home, chanting "No Vietnamese ever called me the N-word." Middle-class professionals, scientists, and even some politicians joined teach-ins and marches. Most crucially, veterans and active duty soldiers became some of the war's fiercest critics. Groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War held public hearings where soldiers testified about atrocities and policy failures. GIs published underground newspapers from bases and ships, and some units refused combat missions. The movement wasn't just people avoiding the war. It was millions of people, including those who had already fought in it, saying the war was wrong. 77. Watergate was just a burglary. The high school version of Watergate can feel oddly small. Some overzealous Nixon campaign operatives broke into Democratic headquarters at the Watergate complex, got caught, and Nixon resigned. A one-off scandal, cleaned up by the system. The full picture is darker. The burglary was only one piece of a much wider campaign of political espionage and sabotage run out of the White House. Nixon's team created a covert unit called the Plumbers to stop leaks and attack perceived enemies. They broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, to discredit the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers. They used the IRS and FBI to harass journalists, activists, and political opponents. They authorized illegal wiretaps and kept an enemies list. When the Watergate burglars were caught, the White House orchestrated hush money payments, leaned on the CIA to derail the FBI investigation, and lied repeatedly to the public. The scandal wasn't just about a break-in. It was about a presidency that treated the law as an obstacle to be bypassed and the state's power as a private weapon. 78. Richard Nixon opened China purely for peace. The story you usually get is Nixon, the visionary statesman, bravely flying to Beijing in 1972 to open China, ease tensions, and usher in an era of peace. It's framed as a generous outreach, almost a diplomatic charity project. What you don't hear as much is the cold calculation behind it. By the late 1960s, China and the Soviet Union were bitter rivals, even skirmishing on their border. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw a chance to exploit that split. By cozying up to Mao, the US put pressure on Moscow, hoping to play the two communist giants against each other. It was less "let's all be friends" and more "let's divide our enemies and get leverage." The opening to China helped secure arms control talks with the Soviets and improved America's strategic position in the Cold War. It also helped American corporations access a massive future market. Peaceful motives were part of it. Power politics and profit were too. 79. Ronald Reagan single-handedly won the Cold War. Textbooks love this one. The narrative goes, Reagan gets elected, calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, ramps up defense spending, and the USSR collapses under the pressure. Curtain falls, democracy triumphs, roll credits with a patriotic soundtrack. Reality was a lot messier and a lot less centered on one man. The Soviet Union was already rotting from the inside, a stagnant economy, failed agriculture, a disastrous war in Afghanistan, and an authoritarian system that couldn't reform without unraveling. Eastern European populations were restless, organizing labor movements like Solidarity in Poland, and constant dissident networks elsewhere. Earlier policies, like détente and arms control treaties under Nixon, Ford, and Carter, had already changed the strategic landscape. And then there was Mikhail Gorbachev, whose own reforms, glasnost and perestroika, sped up the implosion. Reagan's military buildup and diplomacy, including later arms reduction treaties, mattered. But they were one factor among many global and internal forces. The Cold War didn't end because of a lone cowboy president. It ended because an empire that was already cracking finally broke. 80. Trickle-down economics helps everyone eventually. You may have been taught a comforting little economic fairy tale: cut taxes for the rich and corporations, reduce regulations, and the benefits will trickle down to everyone through investment, jobs, and higher wages. Rising tide, lifted boats, all that. This theory got its big moment in the 1980s with Reaganomics, but versions of it have been repeated ever since. The actual results? Wealth and income shot upward, while the promised broad gains fizzled. Top tax rates dropped dramatically. Corporate profits soared. CEO pay exploded. Meanwhile, real wages for many workers stagnated or barely budged. Unions were weakened, and job security eroded. Inequality widened to levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Cuts to social programs and public services hit the poor and working class hardest, even as deficits ballooned. Economists studied decades of data and found little evidence that big tax cuts for the wealthy reliably generate enough growth to pay for themselves or significantly raise wages for everyone else. Trickle down didn't trickle, it pooled at the top. 81. The war on drugs reduced drug harm fairly. The war on drugs is usually taught as a tough but necessary response to rising drug use and crime, aimed at keeping communities safe. Strong laws, harsh penalties, zero tolerance. The implication is that the policy might have been strict, but at least it was even-handed and effective. It wasn't. From the 1970s onward, federal and state drug policies focused heavily on street-level users and small-time dealers, not major traffickers. Mandatory minimums and sentencing disparities, like the infamous 100-to-1 crack versus powder cocaine ratio, meant Black and Latino communities were hit far harder than white users committing similar offenses. Police flooded certain neighborhoods with aggressive tactics, stop and frisk, and mass sweeps, while suburban drug use often met rehab instead of prison. Overdose deaths and addiction didn't disappear, they shifted and morphed. When the opioid crisis later hit predominantly white rural and suburban areas, the response suddenly emphasized treatment over punishment. The war on drugs didn't fairly reduce harm. It criminalized generations of people of color, fractured families, and helped build the machinery of mass incarceration. 82. Mass incarceration rose because crime alone rose. The standard explanation for America's prison boom is simple. Crime went up, so more people went to prison. End of story. That sounds logical, but it ignores the deliberate policy choices that turned the United States into the world's leading jailer. Violent crime did increase in the 1960s and 70s, but starting in the 1980s, politicians from both parties embraced tough-on-crime strategies that went far beyond responding to crime rates. They pushed mandatory minimum sentences, three-strikes laws, and truth in sentencing rules that kept people locked up longer. They expanded the list of offenses that could land you in prison and treated many nonviolent drug crimes as serious felonies. Police departments adopted broken windows and zero-tolerance tactics, increasing arrests for minor infractions. Parole and probation became tripwires that sent people back to prison for technical violations. Even as crime began to fall in the 1990s, incarceration kept climbing. The spike in prison populations wasn't an automatic reaction to crime. It was the product of conscious legal and political decisions that made imprisonment the default solution. 83. The Iran-Contra affair was a minor scandal. In many textbooks, Iran-Contra gets a paragraph. Some officials tried to help anti-communist rebels, broke a few rules, hearings happened, and everyone moved on. It sounds like a bureaucratic mix-up, not a constitutional crisis. The reality was more serious. In the 1980s, Congress had passed laws limiting U.S. aid to the Contras, a rebel group fighting the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration wanted to support the Contras anyway. So officials set up a covert scheme, secretly sell arms to Iran, then under an arms embargo and officially considered an enemy, and use the profits to fund the Contras, bypassing Congress entirely. They also hoped the arms sales would secure the release of American hostages. This operation violated stated U.S. policy, ignored congressional restrictions, and shredded the idea that only Congress controls the purse strings. When it started to unravel, documents were shredded and lies were told to investigators. A number of officials were indicted, and some were convicted, only to be pardoned later. Calling it a minor scandal glosses over the fact that the executive branch ran a secret foreign policy in defiance of the law. 84. The fall of the Berlin Wall ended history's conflicts. The image of East and West Berliners tearing down the wall in 1989 is often presented as the triumphant end of an era. Freedom wins, the Cold War is over, and with it, the last big chapter of violent conflict. Some commentators even talked about the end of history, as if liberal democracy had permanently won, and the hard parts were behind us. The actual 1990s and 2000s didn't get that memo. As the Soviet Union collapsed, new wars erupted in places like the Balkans, with ethnic cleansing and genocidal violence in Bosnia and Kosovo. In Rwanda, nearly 1 million people were murdered in 100 days. The United States launched the Gulf War in 1991, then later invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, triggering long occupations and insurgencies. NATO expanded eastward, setting the stage for future tensions with Russia. Economic shock therapy in former communist countries led to social upheaval and oligarchic wealth grabs. Old empires dissolved, but new power struggles, interventions, and proxy fights took their place. The wall fell, but history didn't stop. It just changed shape. 85. Columbus Day was an ancient American tradition. In school, you might get the impression that Columbus Day is this deep, timeless American holiday rooted in the founding era, part of some uninterrupted patriotic tradition. It's not. Columbus didn't become a big national symbol until much later, and not for the reasons you might think. For a long time, he was just one explorer among many in the historical background. The real push for Columbus Day came from Italian Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were facing vicious discrimination, lynchings, and stereotypes. Catholic, not quite white, and seen as un-American. Italian American groups and the Knights of Columbus lobbied hard to elevate Columbus as a heroic, Catholic, Italian-linked figure who could be claimed as part of the American story. Politicians saw an opportunity, a unifying myth that could fold new immigrants into the national narrative. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1937, under FDR, after decades of ethnic politics, lobbying, and image-making, not because of some ancient, uninterrupted tradition. 86 Thanksgiving was always a national holiday. The textbook version of Thanksgiving jumps straight from Pilgrims and Wampanoag sharing a peaceful feast in 1621 to modern Americans eating turkey and watching football, as if it was an unbroken yearly ritual from the very beginning. It wasn't. For centuries, Thanksgiving was more of an occasional religious or civic observance called for after good harvests, military victories, or surviving disasters. Different colonies and then different states held them at different times. There was no standard date, no single national holiday. The push for a consistent, nationwide Thanksgiving came largely from one tireless 19th century magazine editor, Sarah Josepha Hale. For decades, she wrote letters and editorials campaigning for a national day of thanks to promote unity and morality. Presidents sometimes proclaimed one-off Thanksgivings, especially George Washington and later presidents during crises, but it never stuck as an annual event. Only during the Civil War did Abraham Lincoln, looking for a way to foster national solidarity amid slaughter, proclaim a recurring national Thanksgiving in 1863. The holiday as we know it was less Pilgrim tradition and more 19th century wartime invention. 87. The flag code makes patriotic rituals legally mandatory. You might remember reciting the Pledge of Allegiance at school, being told to stand, hand on heart, face the flag. Maybe you even heard something about a flag code that requires all this behavior by law. That framing blurs a crucial line. The U.S. flag code, first adopted in 1942, is mostly a set of guidelines and etiquette suggestions for how to display and treat the flag, when to fly it, how to fold it, what counts as respectful. It does use shall language, which sounds very official, but there are no meaningful criminal penalties attached to most of it. And even when states tried to enforce compulsory flag salutes or punish disrespect, the Supreme Court stepped in. In 1943, in West Virginia v. Barnett, the court ruled that public schools cannot force students to salute the flag or say the pledge. Later decisions protected flag burning as symbolic speech. The First Amendment trumps the etiquette manual. A lot of what gets presented as legally required patriotism is actually custom, social pressure, and performance, not enforceable law. 88. The Founding Fathers intended a Christian nation. Textbooks often lean hard into images of praying founders, Bible quotes, and vague talk about Judeo-Christian values, leaving students with the impression that the United States was explicitly designed as a Christian nation. The actual founding documents and the founders' beliefs tell a more complicated story. The Constitution itself never mentions Christianity or Jesus. Instead, it explicitly bans religious tests for public office in Article 6. The First Amendment bars Congress from establishing a religion or prohibiting its free exercise. Many leading founders were not Orthodox Christians but deists or skeptics. People like Jefferson, Franklin, and Paine, who believed in some higher power but rejected key doctrines and institutional churches. In 1797, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Tripoli, which stated that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and the Senate ratified it unanimously. Individual founders had their own personal faiths, but the constitutional framework they created avoided linking the nation to a specific religion on purpose. 89. The Second Amendment was always interpreted the same way. In the modern debate, you often hear people talk about the Second Amendment as if its meaning has been fixed and obvious since 1791. The individual right to own guns, exactly as currently understood, supposedly stretches in an unbroken line from the founders to today. That's not how constitutional interpretation has worked. For most of U.S. history, courts and commentators focused heavily on the well-regulated militia part. The amendment was widely seen as tied to state militias and collective defense, not a freestanding individual right unrelated to that context. States and cities passed all kinds of gun regulations on concealed carry, certain types of weapons, and where guns could be brought without courts striking them down as unconstitutional. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a well-funded political and legal movement pushed a different view, emphasizing an individual right to gun ownership detached from militia service. That campaign culminated in the 2008 Supreme Court case District of Columbia v. Heller, which for the first time clearly held that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a handgun for self-defense in the home. The original meaning people talk about today is, in large part, a recent legal construction. 90. Immigrants refuse to learn English in every era. You've probably heard someone complain that today's immigrants don't learn English like they supposedly did in the good old days. Teachers and politicians often echo the idea that earlier waves eagerly assimilated, while modern newcomers stubbornly cling to their languages. History shows a repeating pattern instead. In the 18th and 19th centuries, German-speaking communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the Midwest ran German-language schools, churches, and newspapers for generations. Nativists warned that German would overtake English and doom American culture. In the early 20th century, massive numbers of Italian, Yiddish, Polish, and other language newspapers flourished in American cities. Parents spoke their native tongues at home. Children gradually shifted to English outside. World War I and II sparked backlashes, with laws targeting foreign languages in schools. Each time, the same complaint surfaced: these immigrants aren't learning English fast enough. Each time, the second and third generations ended up English dominant, often losing fluency in their grandparents' language altogether. The cycle isn't new. The anxiety is. The pattern of gradual language shift is the norm. 91. The melting pot erased ethnic conflict. The melting pot metaphor is usually taught as a warm, inclusive myth. People from all over the world come to America, toss their differences into a big cultural stew, and emerge as one harmonious people. The implication is that America somehow transcended old hatreds and ethnic divisions. The historical record is rougher. From the 19th century onward, waves of immigrants, Irish, Chinese, Italians, Jews, Mexicans, and many others, faced hostility, violence, and exclusionary laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act, anti-Catholic riots, lynchings of Italian immigrants, and quotas targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans all coexisted with the rhetoric of the melting pot. Black Americans, indigenous peoples, and many Asian and Latino groups were often explicitly kept outside the circle of who was allowed to melt into whiteness. Whiteness itself expanded over time to include some formerly excluded Europeans, but it stayed built on a racial hierarchy. American identity didn't emerge from a gentle, equal blending. It grew alongside segregation, nativism, and legal discrimination. The melting pot story smooths over how many people were burned or left out entirely. 92. The frontier closed and native history ended. In school, you probably heard some version of the line that the frontier closed in 1890, like a door quietly shutting on the Indian Wars and the Wild West, and then native people sort of fade out of the story. The narrative implies that once the Census Bureau said there was no more continuous frontier line, indigenous history was over, absorbed into America, or confined to reservations. That framing was always for white audiences. Indigenous nations didn't disappear. They survived catastrophic violence, dispossession, and forced assimilation, then adapted in every generation. The late 19th and 20th centuries are full of indigenous resistance, fighting the allotment of reservation lands, organizing against boarding schools, forming the Society of American Indians in 1911, then the National Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement. Occupations at Alcatraz and Wounded Knee. Court battles over land, water, and treaty rights. Today, tribal governments negotiate gaming compacts, run colleges, push for language revitalization, and fight pipelines on ancestral territory. The frontier myth lets textbooks close the book in 1890. Indigenous nations never did. 93. Public schools taught a neutral national story. The way textbooks are presented in school, you'd think they're just objective containers of facts, like a ledger of what really happened, free from politics. In reality, the story public schools told about America has always been a battleground. Textbooks don't fall from the sky. They are approved by boards and legislators with very specific agendas. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, textbooks leaned hard into Protestant, Anglo-Saxon glorification, downplaying slavery and presenting native dispossession as progress. After World War I, there was a wave of patriotic textbook campaigns to counter so-called un-American ideas. In the Cold War, anti-communism shaped how labor unions, social movements, and even the New Deal were portrayed. Civil rights struggles pushed publishers to soften or revise blatantly racist sections, but they often replaced them with sanitized narratives of inevitable progress and heroic presidents. More recently, fights in places like Texas and Florida have decided whether books can mention systemic racism, LGBTQ people, or the full brutality of slavery. Calling textbook history neutral hides how much myth-making, lobbying, and censorship went into creating the version you saw in class. 94. Presidents always faithfully follow the Constitution. The civics class version of the presidency treats the Constitution like a strict rulebook every president follows faithfully, maybe with a few honest disagreements. The real record is a catalog of creative stretching, ignoring and reinterpreting constitutional limits whenever war, crisis, or raw ambition made it convenient. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War and tolerated military arrests of civilians. Woodrow Wilson presided over the Espionage and Sedition Acts, jailing people for anti-war speech. Franklin Roosevelt interned over 100,000 Japanese Americans without due process. Harry Truman sent troops to Korea without a formal declaration of war. Nixon's administration ran secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. George W. Bush's lawyers wrote memos trying to redefine torture and justify indefinite detention and warrantless wiretapping. Barack Obama dramatically expanded drone warfare, including targeted killings of American citizens abroad. Each time, presidents claimed the Constitution allowed it, or that emergency powers covered the gap. Courts sometimes pushed back, often years later. The idea that presidents simply follow the Constitution skips the long history of pushing past its edges and asking forgiveness, not permission. 95. The Supreme Court is above politics. In school, the Supreme Court is usually introduced as the calm, wise branch of government, 9 robed referees, carefully applying the law, safely insulated from the messy world of politics. On paper, lifetime appointments and salary protections were supposed to encourage independence. In practice, the court has always been deeply entangled in the political battles of its era. The infamous Dred Scott decision sided with slaveholders. Plessy v. Ferguson blessed segregation. In the early 20th century, the court struck down minimum wage and labor laws in the name of freedom of contract, aligning with business interests. FDR's court-packing threat wasn't about abstract theory. It was a political struggle over the New Deal. In the 1950s and 60s, a more liberal court handed down Brown v. Board, Miranda, and other rights-expanding rulings, triggering political backlash and decades of conservative legal organizing. Modern confirmation fights are openly ideological campaigns. Decisions on voting rights, campaign finance, abortion, labor, and civil rights often split along the party lines of the presidents who appointed the justices. The court isn't separate from politics. It's one of the main arenas where politics gets decided. 96. America has always been a meritocracy. The comforting story says America is a level playing field. Talent and hard work rise to the top, and if someone is powerful or rich, it's because they earned it. From the start, the rules said otherwise. The Constitution left voting and office holding mostly to states, which limited both to property-owning men. Enslaved labor created vast fortunes that were passed down as generational wealth, while black families were legally barred from owning themselves, let alone land. After slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, and redlining blocked black communities from building wealth, even as the GI Bill and federal housing subsidies helped white families buy homes and go to college. Women couldn't vote nationally until 1920, and were often pushed out of higher education and professions for decades after. Native people were moved, confined, and bureaucratically erased. Asian and Latino immigrants faced exclusion laws and segregated labor markets. Elite universities used legacy preferences and character tests to favor the already connected. Even today, unpaid internships, legacy admissions, and networks of family and school ties quietly shape who gets in the door. Hard work matters, but it has never been the only, or even the main, currency. 97. History progresses in a straight line toward freedom. The standard narrative arcs through abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights, and marriage equality, as if each victory naturally led to the next part of an inevitable march toward justice. The idea is comforting. Things were bad, then they got better, then they kept getting better. History on the ground looks more like a staircase with trapdoors. Reconstruction briefly expanded black political power in the South, black legislators, schools, voting, then was violently rolled back by white supremacist terror, poll taxes, and Jim Crow. The 14th Amendment was gutted by court decisions for decades. The labor movement won protections in the 1930s. Later, those gains were chipped away. The civil rights wins of the 1960s were followed by mass incarceration and the war on drugs. The Voting Rights Act was hailed as a cornerstone of democracy, then weakened in the 2013 Shelby County decision, after which states rapidly passed new restrictions. LGBTQ rights saw major advances, but also waves of backlash legislation. Rights in the U.S. have expanded, yes, but often in cycles: advance, backlash, partial loss, new struggle. There's nothing automatic about the arrow pointing forward. 98. Patriotism means never questioning the past. In a lot of classrooms, patriotism is presented as loyalty without discomfort. Stand for the pledge, respect the flag, speak of the founders in hushed tones, and don't dwell on the ugly parts. Questioning the national story is framed as ungrateful or even un-American. But most of the democratic reform students are taught to celebrate started with people challenging exactly that kind of patriotic silence. Abolitionists called slavery a national sin when mainstream leaders wanted to compromise. Suffragists were mocked and arrested for demanding women's political rights. Labor organizers were beaten and jailed for challenging the sanctity of industrial capitalism. Civil rights activists were branded outside agitators, communists, and traitors. Anti-war protesters were told they were helping the enemy. Whistleblowers exposing illegal surveillance or war crimes were labeled unpatriotic. Over and over, the people who pushed the U.S. closer to its stated ideals did so by criticizing, questioning, and refusing to accept the official story. Honest patriotism isn't about protecting myths. It's about caring enough to confront the truth and insist the country live up to the promises it keeps printing in the textbooks. 99. U.S. history class tells the whole story. The biggest lie isn't any single event. It's the quiet assumption that what you got in school was basically the whole story, with maybe a few minor gaps. The textbook opens in 1492 or with some cheerful chapter called First Americans, then glides through colonies, founding fathers, a couple of wars, some sad but necessary segments on slavery and segregation, and ends with America, imperfect but always improving. The conflicts are streamlined, the villains are softened. Whole groups barely appear unless they're props in someone else's drama. Enslaved people show up as a problem, not as thinkers, rebels, and organizers. Indigenous nations appear at contact, then fade. Workers, tenants, prisoners, queer people, disabled people, migrants, anti-war activists are either invisible or reduced to a paragraph about reform movements. Violence by the state is turned into clashes, unrest, troubles. Genocide becomes removal, coups become interventions. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. And whenever the story gets too ugly, the narrative zooms out and reassures you that in the long run, America corrects itself. That quiet confidence is part of the curriculum. It teaches you to treat any missing voices as unimportant, any contradiction as a footnote, any horror as an unfortunate detour on the road to greatness. The truth is that U.S. history is not a single story moving in one direction. It's overlapping, conflicting stories, some of which were deliberately erased or buried. What you learned was a curated slice, shaped by politics, money, and fear of controversy. The lie isn't just what they put in, it's what they left out and taught you not to miss. If the past feels too simple to be real, that's because they designed it that way.